Excerpt from November 1984's Deluxe Comics, Wally Wood's Thunder Agents #1, written by David M. Singer. Only the good die young. The year was 1965. Mission Impossible was hot. The Man from U.N.C.L.E. was hotter. James Bond, in Goldfinger and Thunderball, was the hottest of all. One might have expected a comic book publisher to simply rip off the genre. One might have, but it didn't quite happen that way. A paperback publisher named Tower, long noted for its habit of recycling old stories and cover art to save money, decided the time was right to put out an inexpensively produced comic book to cash in on the then current craze for secret agents. Tower's mistake was in hiring Wally Wood to package the book. Surrounding himself with an assortment of talented professionals, including Lynn Brown, Bill Pearson, and Harry Shorten, Wood conceived a series that combined the best of both the secret agent genre and the superhero genre. Even today, Wood's original run of the Thunder Agents is considered by most comics pros to be the best series of the 1960s. To make the book stand out from the usual 12-cent, 32-page package of the time, Tower decided to publish a 25-cent, 64-page comic book with rotating features, including Dynamo, NoMan, the Thunder Squad, Raven, Menthor, and Lightning. It was like getting an annual every couple of months. And the art, the art you could die from. Al Williamson doing covers, Gil Kane doing the Raven, Reed Crandall doing NoMan, Steve Ditko on Menthor, and on Dynamo, the master, Wally Wood. Tower had been interested in producing profitable pulp knockoffs. Wood produced timeless classics. Harvey produced Steranko's Spyman, Simon and Kirby's Fighting American, and Gil Kane's Tiger Boy during the same time period. Gold Key released Russ Manning's Magnus Robot Fighter, and Dan Spiegel's Dr. Solar Man of the Atom. Steve Ditko and Dick Giordano produced Nuclear for Dell, which also released superheroes featuring the Fab Four, as well as Dracula, Wolfman, and Frankenstein, all superhero titles. American Comics Group brought out two superheroes, Magic Man and Nemesis. Archie Comics revived the Golden Age heroes from the 1940s and renamed them the Mighty Crusaders. MF Productions released Fat Man, the Human Flying Saucer, by Captain Marvel's creators C.C. Beck and Otto Bender, as well as a new android hero named, oddly enough, Captain Marvel. A great deal of excellent and far less than excellent productivity took place in the comic book industry during the late 1960s. But out of this great morass, only one series still stands out some 2 decades later, Wally Wood's Thunder Agents. Excerpt from Don Markstein's Toonopedia. In the mid-1960s, with James Bond riding high in books and movies, and The Man from U.N.C.L.E. riding high on TV, flamboyant, high-profile spies, if that isn't a contradiction in terms, were all the rage, especially if they worked for agencies that had cool initials. In comic books, Marvel responded with Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. in 1965. That same year, Tower Books, a paperback publisher, entered the comic book field with Thunder Agents. Like most contemporary acronymic agency names, Thunder stood for words that have clear meanings separately, but are kind of hard to figure out when put together. In this case, it was the Higher United Nations Defense Enforcement Reserves. United Nations, we understand, but what would be the Higher United Nations? And these guys do what? Enforce defense? And if they're merely reserves, how come they're on active duty all the time? Fortunately, 1960s audiences seldom looked at their spy thrillers closely enough to be bothered by nitpicky questions like these. Being 1960s comic book characters, the Thunder Agents were mostly superheroes. Dynamo was the brawny guy of the group. He had a high-tech belt that could make him invulnerable and super strong. NoMan was a spook type, similar in appearance to a DC character, the Spectre, with spook-like superpowers as well. But again, with high-tech rather than mystical sources for his abilities. Menthor had mental powers, again from a high-tech source. Rounding out the cast were a commando team called the Thunder Squad. The series was created by Wallace Wood, who's already been seen throughout the comics industry since 1947. Aside from this series, he was best known for his work at EC Comics, and for sex-charged features like Sally Forth and Cannon. Wood was mainly responsible for the overall look of the series. Thunder Agents got rave reviews in fanzines of the time, and was quickly spun off into new titles. Dynamo and NoMan got their own comics, and another new comic introduced a sister agency, Undersea, don't ask. But the boom was short-lived. A year or two into the series, sales began to falter, possibly because of a general downward trend in superhero comics as the Batman TV craze faded, possibly because the public was beginning to lose interest in initialized spy agencies. Excerpt from the Comic Book Heroes, the first history of modern comic books from the Silver Age to the present, by Gerard Jones and Will Jacobs. Chapter 17, Artists and Heroes. For all the Archies and Milton Fasses jumping on the superhero bandwagon, hardly any new creative blood was coming in. There were writers Roy Thomas and Jim Shooter and, over at Warren Publishing, Archie Goodwin. But nary a new artist to be found. So many old hands from the 1940s boom years were kicking around looking for work that a few phone calls and a little bit of money were all an inexperienced publisher needed to slap together a squad of veterans who could crank out a passable looking comic book with no supervision. But you have to be careful when you let artists, even comic book artists, go unsupervised. You might let something out of the bottle that can never be put back in. Wally Wood was one of the most respected artists in the business, at least among his peers, if not among the more deadline-minded editors. He'd become a favorite of fan addicts for his science fiction work for EC, with his wonderfully controlled surfaces, but seething masses of detail and horrifying undercurrents. His own surface was mild, his emotions turbulent. Once an unwitting editor tried to suggest improvements to a Wood page in front of other artists. Without a word, Wood grabbed the page and walked out, never to return. He alternated days-long marathons of sleepless work and drinking binges, so that even by the 60s, when he was still shy of 40, his art was showing a lot less intensity and detail, although the line work was still pristine. There's no telling what demons haunted poor Woody, but he always showed an obsession with hordes of vile aliens attacking the Earth in waves of fire and bloodshed. He'd created and packaged a series of trading cards, a masterpiece of luridness called Mars Attacks, with a writer named Lynn Brown. Then, with his old art assistant Joe Orlando, he helped Jim Warren set up Creepy and Eerie, bringing in nearly all his old EC cronies. He may have been a problem as a staff artist, but as a free agent he could perform miracles. In 1965, Harry Shorten of Tower Books, one of the most trend-conscious of low-end paperback publishers, decided he'd better get in on the comic book boom. His plan was to publish his own comics and then collect them in paperbacks like the extremely popular Mad books, which were helping make Bill Gaines rich. His gimmick was a regular comic book series in the double size for a quarter format that other publishers used for specials and reprints, figuring America's affluent and comics-hungry kids could find an extra 13 cents for something they had to have. To make sure they had to have it, he called on an Archie cartoonist named Sam Schwartz to launch Tippy Teen, a title hilarious to all those 8-year-olds who remembered the big hit song of 1938, and hired Wally Wood to help Schwartz create a superhero line. Wood said he, quote, functioned as a freelance editor and did as much of the art as I could, unquote. For the art he couldn't do, he and Schwartz brought in Wally's old cohort, Reed Crandall, and got Gil Kane and Mike Sikowski to squeeze a few pages into their schedules, promising them a lack of editorial interference that they found quite refreshing. Soon enough, that other singular force, Steve Ditko, was on board, along with Wood's assistant, Dan Adkins, and a lot of experienced hands to help out, Mike Esposito, Joe Giella, Paul Reinman, George Tuska, Ogden Whitney, and more. Not surprisingly for an artist who resented all intrusions into his private visions, Wood didn't pursue veteran writers. He brought over his partner from trading cards, Lynn Brown, and raided fandom for a few more hands, Larry Ivey, Roger Brand, Bill Pearson, who could string the action scenes together with a few functional words. The funny part about hiring this crew for this job was that Wood and Crandall didn't like superheroes, and usually strove not to do them, while Kane and Sikowski had been doing nothing else lately and were getting sick of them. So Wood compromised, combining the cape and cowl icon with the more reality-based spy genre, and cooking up a sort of Uncle, UNCLE, that created its own super operatives. Thunder Agents #1, cover dated November 1965. The creators couldn't take the superhero stuff seriously, playing their star, Dynamo, as a bit of a goof. The stories were at their best in their little humor bits. Jumping into the air, Dynamo cries, "Now to get back up to the penthouse, in a single leap." The next panel shows him standing on a ledge halfway up the building, saying, might take 2 leaps. The big selling point, though, was the art. Wood and Crandall created sleek and gorgeous. Kane strutted his action chops like Julie Schwartz had never let him. And it did sell. Tower followed with Undersea Agent, dated January 1966, Dynamo, dated August 1966, and NoMan, dated November 1966, along with a war comic called Fight the Enemy, August 1966. Harry Shorten got 4 paperbacks out of them. Wood and his crew plotted and drew with an abandon that showed they were having a great time, even if they didn't expect this to last long. They were also willing to break the rules. Dynamo went up against one of Wood's potent alien invasions, but this time the aliens were unseen infiltrators, Wood substituting a truly eerie paranoia for a blood feast. NoMan was an android who, quote-unquote, died at least once per issue as his bodies were destroyed. Once, when down to his last body, he thinks, "If they kill me now, I'm dead." Later, in angry resentment of his own android nature, he hurls one body after another to its destruction in a globe-trotting orgy of suicide. In that same issue, Steve Ditko shocked everybody in fandom by showing a hero shot 6 times at close range and dying. No superhero who'd been around for more than 1 issue had ever been killed before. Jim Shooter's Feral Lad story was still 6 months away, and it happened with brutal Ditko intensity. There was a message here. The artist had something to say, and they were restless to say it. Excerpt from 2002's The Thunder Agents Archives, Volume 1, Foreword by Robert Klein and Michael Uslan, November 1961. Stan Lee ushers in the Marvel Age of Comics with the publication of Fantastic Four #1, adding to the explosion of a new Silver Age of comic books begun by DC Comics' Showcase #4 in October 1956, which introduced the new Flash to the world. By the mid-60s, companies such as Charlton, Dell, Gold Key, Harvey, Milson, Mighty, MF, and others would join the superhero fervor to often lackluster and inconsistent results punctuated by moments of brilliance. September 1964, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. primetime television series debuts on NBC, taking the James Bond spy craze to dazzling new heights. August 1965, amid building anticipation for the January 1966 debut of ABC's Batman primetime television series, Thunder Agents No. 1, cover dated November 1965, appears on the newsstands without fanfare of any kind. Its creation and publication clearly a result of the two events described which preceded it. It's true, Thunder Agents No. 1 arrived unheralded, without publicity, promotion, or advertising, but with a staggering impact which still resonates almost 40 years later. Remember, in those days there was no Wizard magazine or Comics Buyer's Guide to alert the fans. There weren't many comic book conventions. There were no websites to gossip on about new comic book companies or titles. It just appeared. We were two 14-year-old comic book fanatics on the day we spotted the first issue in the neighborhood comic rack. It was a real tale of the unexpected, perhaps even a tale to astonish all comic book fans and casual readers alike. There it was, just about as perfect a comic book as we'd ever seen. What made it so unusual? It was 25 cents when all other comic books were 12 or 15 cents. It was 68 pages when all regular comic books were 36 pages. It was an annual-sized comic book that contained all new heroes and stories. It was a comic book published by a mysterious, unheard-of comic book company called T.H.U.N.D.E.R. We couldn't believe our eyes. We stared at the cover of the first issue. There wasn't a single caption or blurb explaining who these electrifying new superheroes were. Clearly the guy in the middle was a Superman type with a Shazamish lightning bolt on his shirt. He was busy tossing the forerunner of one of today's Star Wars stormtroopers into detailed machinery. Behind him, racing to help, was Holy Hannah. Was that the Atom? For the first 5 minutes we were staring at that cover, we didn't even notice the third, kinda invisible guy on the right. Was that the Spectre? Could this be some DC comic book in sheep's clothing? The only thing our eyes were certain of was that this was drawn by one of our favorite artists ever. The one who arguably drew the best women in the old EC comic books. The one who had just reinvented Marvel's Daredevil, designing an all-red costume and stylish new logo for him. The one who drew the hippest science fiction war comic for Gold Key called Total War. The one who drew the best comic strip parodies in Mad. The one and only Wally Wood. But how did Wally Wood end up at T.H.U.N.D.E.R? Harry Shorten, the first editor of MLJ Comics, later to become Archie Comics Incorporated, had been brought in as the publisher of the new T.H.U.N.D.E.R comics. The first decision that was made concerned the size and price of the product. T.H.U.N.D.E.R comics were, like Archie Comics, tied to a company called PDC, Publishers Distribution Corporation, as its distributor. It was PDC which pushed the notion of T.H.U.N.D.E.R publishing 25-cent comic books instead of 12 or 15-cent comics. If the sales were good, the word was that it would be more profitable for retailers as well as the distributor in T.H.U.N.D.E.R. Harry then pulled together the key people who would execute the business plan. Shorten's familiarity with talent came primarily from his years at Archie, and so he hired Sam Schwartz, known for doing to Jughead what Carl Barks did to Donald Duck, redefining the character's personality, introducing new supporting cast members, and creating good stories, to be both the managing editor, head administrator, as well as one of the creators of the obligatory Archie-style comic book that they would also publish, eventually debuting as Tippy-Teen. He added artist Dan DiCarlo, who designed the Tippy-Teen characters with Sam, Harry Lucy, and Bill Vigoda, Archie veterans all. With Sam Schwartz not very familiar with or comfortable editing superhero adventure books, publisher Harry Shorten cut a dream deal with Wally Wood. Sam would handle the Tippy-Teen titles, as well as the new Undersea Agent comic book, and the war comic book called Fight the Enemy. He'd be the managing editor of the company and its day-to-day office executive. Wood would be granted a wide latitude of creative and business freedom, devoid of a 9-to-5 office job or hefty administrative duties, and be allowed to concentrate on creating characters and concepts for an expanding line of superhero comics. He was to arm his books with solid writers and some of the best artists in the industry. In addition to Wood himself, writers included Larry Ivey, Lynn Brown, Bill Pearson, Steve Skates, Dan Adkins, Russ Jones, Gil Kane, and Ralph Reese. Meanwhile, back at the comic book rack, as our initial excitement and confusion began to subside, we finally opened up Thunder Agents No. 1. It was the comics version of an Artist's Hall of Fame. Wally Wood, Reed Crandall, the best Blackhawk artist of the Golden Age, as well as one of the most venerated artists to appear in the EC horror titles and their descendants, Creepy and Eerie, Gil Kane, the Green Lantern and Atom artist, and Mike Sekowsky, the Justice League of America artist. 6 fast-moving stories, none longer than 12 pages, were linked by a cohesive, grander structure, not unlike the 1940s Justice Society of America stories in DC's All-Star Comics. Those classics featured individual adventures of superheroes who were part of a larger group fighting the issue's master villain, with all of them banding together in a grand finale chapter. The introductory story, though a mere 4 pages in length, set the stage well.
Thunder Agents. Introduction. First encounter. November 1965. A team of special United Nations agents parachuted toward a remote mountain location, only to face enemy fire from within the compromised lab of Professor Jennings. The enemy fell back and escaped in a helicopter, leaving the body of Jennings, who looks like he put up quite a struggle. An agent cursed. We shouldn't have let him work alone. The greatest mind in the free world. world. This was clearly the work of the mysterious warlord, whose evil forces were active throughout the globe. We first heard of him 2 years ago, when an attempt was made to steal the newest atomic engine from one of his captured men. They learned Warlord had recruited every available criminal and spy, and was out to steal every scientific development he can. Even within his organization, the Warlord was an enigma to all but his top lieutenants. The Warlord's men had made off with the professor's inventions, for which no notes were kept, and no duplicates could be produced. They didn't have time to get everything, sir. Look at these. The prototype models were taken to the higher United Nations Defense Enforcement Reserve's secret headquarters, though even there, many could not be deciphered. However, a few were successfully analyzed. 1. An electron molecular intensifier belt, which would make the wearer's body structure change to the consistency of steel. 2. A light polarizer material, which is completely non-reflecting. In effect, an invisibility cloak. 3. A cybernetic helmet. It could be dangerous, but it could amplify a man's brain power many times over. More remain to be examined, but for now these 3 combined could create a one-man army. But if he were captured, we'd lose all of them. Instead, they would find and train at least 3 special agents, the best. After all, they'll have to be the best to cope with the warlord. And so the search begins.
Excerpt from the December 1981 cover dated The Comic Reader number 197, In-Depth History of the Heroes of T.H.U.N.D.E.R by Lou Mougin. T.H.U.N.D.E.R Comics, which published Thunder and several spin-offs, boiled down to one person, Wallace Wood. As creator of the series, major artist and writer, and self-admitted freelance editor, Wood produced his best commercial comics work of the 60s while at T.H.U.N.D.E.R. The nearly 24 books he worked on during the 1966 through 68 period showcase some of the finest superhero art of the second heroic age, particularly his numerous Dynamo stories. As a result, T.H.U.N.D.E.R became the only third force publisher to equal, and at times surpass, Marvel and DC in art quality. Others who wielded the pencil and brush at T.H.U.N.D.E.R were equally renowned. Few superhero books would ever boast such a distinguished crew. The 4-page introductory sequence fairly breathed cliches, from the doomed scientists who create superheroes to the opposed agencies locked in a global Cold War conflict. But the plot was solid, the concepts didn't stretch reality to the breaking point, and of course, Wood's art pulled the entire thing together. It set several concepts that Thunder would follow to their final issue. Tight, pulp-like plotting, an economy of dialogue, word balloons were kept to 2 per panel most of the time, and believability. The Thunder agents, rather than gaining power from radioactive spiders or gamma bomb explosions, were human beings whose abilities were augmented by mechanical devices. It was a welcome touch of conservatism in a comic universe already top-heavy with sorcerers, omnipotent entities, parallel dimensions, and heroes with every superpower conceivable. Excerpt from the December 1981 cover dated Amazing Heroes number 7, The History of the Thunder Agents by David Singer. Thunder Agents number 1 featured a Wally Wood cover depicting 3 new superheroes no true comics connoisseur could resist. As originally presented in number 1, the Thunder Agents included 3 superpowered agents and a Thunder squad of highly trained but non-super agents. Additionally, the organization boasted unnamed hundreds of field operators who seemed to exist for the sole purpose of being slaughtered in each issue, prior to a superpowered agent saving the day. Issue number 1, in orderly fashion, was divided into 6 chapters. Chapter 1 introduced Thunder. Chapter 2 introduced Super Agent Dynamo. Chapter 3 introduced Super Agent NoMan. Chapter 4 introduced Super Agent Menthor. Chapter 5 introduced the Thunder Squad. And Chapter 6, which was actually the conclusion to the story begun in Chapter 2, teamed them all up in a single adventure. Unlike many comics companies, who slowly developed their characters' personalities over several issues, T.H.U.N.D.E.R gave each of theirs a proper and detailed introduction. And as if that was not sufficient, the subsequent issues included pinup pages with clip them out file cards on both the heroes and major villains. Excerpt from 2002's The Thunder Agents Archives, Volume 1, Foreword by Robert Klein and Michael Uslan. Next, Dynamo made his debut in a tale by Wally Wood and writer Lynn Brown. The story opened inside Thunder headquarters, beneath the United Nations building in New York City. In one panel, Lynn Brown was effectively portrayed as a low-level employee in the administration department. He had what would today be best described as a cubicle with a workstation. We could guess he probably had a lousy commute, a limited time for lunch each day, low pay, and was drowning in bureaucratic paperwork. Excerpt from the December 1981 cover dated The Comic Reader number 197, In-Depth History of the Heroes of T.H.U.N.D.E.R by Lou Mougin. Thunder's biggest blockbuster was introduced 2 pages later with a one-word wood splash panel. The blue and white clad figure from the front cover grimly towered over a pile of rubble, hands on his hips. Behind him was a hole he had made in a brick wall at least 2 feet thick. Dynamo was unleashed. The 12-page origin story opened with a waist shot of our hero as a desk-bound administration official in Thunder HQ. An obvious secret identity type you could recognize at 20 paces. This paperwork isn't for me, he muses. I'm afraid I made a mistake when I accepted this job. Suddenly, his superior enters the room. Leonard Brown, will you come with me, please? How about them apples? Unsuspectingly, Lynn Brown follows his guide through several checkpoints to level 7, the meeting place of Thunder's inner council. Confronted by a semicircle of the West's top spy chiefs, he is offered a chance to become an agent, and in the best comic book hero tradition, accepts. One panel later, Brown is stripped down to blue trunks and boots, and offered Jennings' blue metal belt with a strange dial in the buckle position. Crack! Shades of Captain Marvel. It was obviously derivative of the Big Red Cheese, and just as fun in 1965 as in 1940.
Welcome to Level 7.
Excerpt from the December 1981 cover dated Amazing Heroes number 7, The History of the Thunder Agents by David Singer. The second chapter, titled Menace of the Iron Fog and subtitled Agent Dynamo, introduces the reader to a 23-year-old, sandy-haired, blue-eyed Thunder paper pusher named Leonard Brown. Brown is summoned to Level 7 to meet the High Command of Thunder, which assembles around an elevated horseshoe-shaped table. He is given Professor Jennings' Thunder Belt. After wearing it for 5 minutes so that it can attune itself to his metabolism, Brown turns the dial on the belt and a charge of energy is released, rapidly multiplying his body density. Unlike most comic characters who are depicted as glowing with energy purely for the sake of visual effect, Brown's energy burst is real. In later issues, he will use it with deliberation to repel a group of robots, to disrupt a force field, to herd dinosaurs, to frighten primitive Orientals, to electrocute a tank full of sea monsters, and to blind an opponent. The 6'1" Brown normally weighs 200 pounds, but when he turns on his belt, his weight exceeds 1,000 pounds. Codenamed Agent Dynamo, he wears a costume made from a special metallic fabric, which protects him in a limited fashion when his belt is not in use. The belt gives Dynamo the power of 100 men and makes his body virtually impenetrable. He can laugh at knives, bullets, and blackjacks, but is still vulnerable to missiles and nuclear explosions. And of course, he can be gassed and drowned. Dynamo may not use his belt for an extended period of time, or else the belt removes his strength to the point of rendering him helpless. If he uses the belt for too long at a time, it will kill him. The second chapter also introduced several supporting characters for the series. Sam Short, Lynn's boss, is the head of the Thunder Agents division, and is never referred to by name, but merely as Chief or Sir. His secretary, Alice Robbins, is enamored of Lynn Brown, who after a short period of shyness began to reciprocate. A unique innovation with Dynamo, as with all the Thunder Agents, is that while each agent has a private life, none of them has a secret identity. Technically, Dynamo and the other super agents are classified agents, but as the agents socialize amongst themselves, Lynn and Alice do not have to go through a Clark Kent, Lois Lane, Superman triangle. Excerpt from the Comic Reader number 197 by Lou Mougin. A pair of armored trucks proceed to blanket New York City under a dense fog composed of iron particles. Under cover of the mist, teams of armor-clad raiders stage snatch-and-grab raids of radioactive materials. At this point, the reader first glimpses Dynamo's long-lived ally and adversary, the Iron Maiden, Tower's version of the Dragon Lady. A beautiful redhead who wore a suit of gleaming metal that hugged her curves like a bodysuit, the Iron Maiden played Catwoman to Dynamo's Batman. In over 9 separate clashes with Thunder's big blue blockbuster, she represented the ultimate and unattainable love interest. By issue number 4, she was as much smitten by Dynamo as he with her, yet she steadfastly refused to let it get in the way of her criminal career. One must indeed admire such dedication. Besides, it kept her coming back time and time again, when most other villains usually made one-shot appearances. But in this first clash, Iron Maiden was more Hellcat than Harlequin. In the meantime, Dynamo is dispatched to rid the city of the fog, which he does, and capture the raiders. 1 out of 2 isn't bad. The 4-page fight looked like a 1942 Siegel and Schuster Superman outing. Dynamo merrily demolished a truck, shed bullets like peanut shells, bounced back from a grenade explosion, and took on the Iron Maiden's metal-clad thugs, only to be beaten when his power drain forced him to turn off the Thunderbelt. Dynamo is captured and taken to the Warlord's Island, where the Iron Maiden prepares to dope the secret of his belt out of him. Part 1 ends with Dynamo in chains, to be resolved in the last story of the issue. In the main, Dynamo did bear resemblance to an early Golden Age Superman figure. He was powerful and as durable as a tank, but never invulnerable. Adventure after adventure ended up with a scene of his hospital bed, where he recuperated. He was hospitalized 3 times in 1 month alone. However, Dynamo carried a spirit of boyish buffoonery into his stories. He was fun, never bested in battle. Lynn Brown would regularly report in for a ritual chewing out by the Chief, a combination of Perry White and J. Jonah Jameson, and one of the funniest big boss caricatures of the period. Brown, about as effective with girls as Captain Marvel, fumblingly carried on a love interest with the strip ingenue, Alice Robbins, the boss's secretary. More than anything, Dynamo was the picture of the junior executive superhero. It was Tower's most entertaining strip, and Dynamo rated several stories per issue in the earliest and latest Thunders, besides spinning off into 4 issues of his own book. Excerpt from the Thunder Agent's archives. Foreword. Did the ego of writer Lynn Brown cause him to name the character after himself? No. The impish Wally Wood changed the original name of the character as a prank on his writer. The original name of this employee is apparently lost to history, but not so the original name of the superhero he becomes. Dynamo is going to be named the Thunderbolt. If you examine the lettering in the stories in that first issue, you can see circumstantial evidence of relettering to accommodate the name change. If you want hard evidence, you need to read the Tower Books 1966 paperback Dynamo, which reprints the first issue of Thunder Agents from either the original uncorrected art or proofs. There, on one of the comic book would be page 10, panel 2 of the first Dynamo story, the caption reads, "Even Thunderbolt's iron frame is shaken by the concussion." Wally preferred the name Dynamo for his hero, even though that was a name already assigned to the villain of Thunder Agents number 2. That villain became known as Dynavac instead. Brown was hired to become the agent manning Professor Jennings' Thunderbelt. He rose to the occasion, strapping on the belt and turning the center dial. Immediately, the very atoms of the surrounding air are rent by the charge of energy released. A terrific visual touch by Wood, which bathed Lynn in a bright blue flash. Now our hero had limited super strength and near invulnerability, but only for a few minutes at a time, or else the massive drain on Lynn's energy would become life-threatening. He had to get in, resolve a crisis, and then get the hell out before he either died or was forced to shut down his superpowers. What an interesting conflict for a character to deal with in a comic book. These were the touches that would make each Thunder Agent so special, so real, so different from the other superheroes of the mid-60s. Add a sense of humor reminiscent of the Spirit, and the character reached new heights of pure entertainment. Excerpt from the December 1981 cover dated Amazing Heroes number 7, The History of the Thunder Agents by David Singer. Chapter 3 story lacked a formal title and was simply headed Thunder Agent NoMan. Dr. Anthony G. Dunn, a 76-year-old wheelchair-bound scientist in the employ of Thunder, decides to serve as a guinea pig for his latest invention, which he developed in collaboration with Professor Jennings. Dr. Dunn is wheeled into a mechanical chamber. His entire mental makeup is transferred to electronic impulses, which are then re-etched into the brain of the Doctor's invention, a group of identical androids. Except for the fact that they have pale blue skin, a bald head, and no eyes, the androids look like handsome, phenomenally fit human beings. Each android body is 6 feet tall and weighs 350 pounds. The androids wear identical uniforms, consisting of a skin-tight orange shirt and tights, black shorts, and dark blue boots and belt. The androids are described as having inhuman strength and durability. While an android cannot punch his fist through a brick wall, it can do other things requiring a strength greater than that of a normal man. A body is vulnerable to weapons, such as bullets and knives, but cannot be rendered unconscious no matter how many times it is hit. Likewise, gas has no effect on it. The extra durability also gives the android several seconds of conscious life after it has been mortally wounded. This is important because Dr. Dunn's mind can't exist in only one body at a time. He can, however, project his mind from one body to another as frequently as he likes. Thus, if one android is shot, instance before it dies, it can activate the mind of another android body anywhere in the world. After giving himself the codename NoMan, Dunn is presented with the Cloak of Invisibility by Thunder. There is only one cloak, so if the android wearing it is destroyed, NoMan or another agent of Thunder must make sure to recover it. Unlike most other heroes, NoMan also wears a gun at his side at all times. Technically, Dr. Dunn died so that NoMan could live. His mind itself died with his body. Only his thought patterns were preserved. Like Dynamo with his belt, NoMan has a time limit for the use of his cloak. After 10 minutes of continuous use, the cloak shuts off to recharge itself. The name NoMan was first used in the Odyssey, in which Ulysses, having blinded the Cyclops, referred to himself as NoMan. NoMan in Thunder Agents is invisible to his opponents, as Ulysses was to the blinded Cyclops. An interesting use of the name. In his first adventure, NoMan battles Demo, another agent of the Warlord. During the first year, virtually everyone Thunder fought was either an agent of the Warlord himself, or the Warlord's superiors. Demo was a criminal scientist with fangs, whose assistant was the gorgeous blonde Satana. NoMan defeats Demo and thwarts his plan, but Demo manages to escape, allowing him to return many times in the future. Thunder Agents always thwart the bad guys, destroy their machines, and capture or kill their lackeys, super agents, or monsters, but the villain herself always escapes. This allowed for the rapid build-up of a potential rogues gallery. Excerpt from the Comics Reader number 197 by Lou Mougin, Thunder Agents 101. Dynamo is backed up in Thunder Agents by Tower's number 2 superstar, who debuted immediately after him in issue number 1. In the Android Hero department, Tower beat the Vision and Red Tornado to the punch by more than 3 years. Enter the Android agent NoMan. The blue-skinned humanoid with the darkened eye sockets was another Wood creation, introduced in his initial story with art by Reed Crandall. Without a doubt, NoMan was one of the unique superheroes of his time, and became their most fully rounded character as well. Dr. Anthony Dunn, as we first see him, is a diametric opposite of Dynamo, an aged, infirm, balding scientist bound to a wheelchair. He may have been the most unlikely alter ego ever considered for a superhero. Dunn gives up his human existence a page later to enter a synthetic body. Quote, "For the first time in years, I feel young and strong." The catch was, Dunn had more than one body at his disposal. This led to the cliche of having him killed at least once each issue. But as cliches go, it was pretty unusual. The rest of the story pitted NoMan against Dynamo, who commanded an army of simian submen. The fight that ensued allowed NoMan to strut his stuff by defeating the Caveman gang, using his invisibility cloak and transferring to another body when Dynamo shot him in the chest. While he made his way to the scene of the crime in his new corpus, the villains took it on the lam. The pattern was set for all of NoMan's subsequent adventures. Thunder's synthetic superhero was the least derivative of the entire lot. Naturally, the gimmick of placing a human mind in an artificial body had been around at least as long as Frankenstein, and had a clear pair of genre antecedents in DC's two versions of Robot Man. But NoMan was clearly not a copy, and he soon gained the best characterization of the Thunder cabal as writers began to play up the psychic crisis of adjusting to life in a non-human body. Oddly, nobody in the series except NoMan seemed to notice the difference. To Dynamo, Menthor, and Lightning, he was just one of the boys. Excerpt from Foreword by Robert Klein and Michael Uslan. Tower's answer to the Invisible Man was the next beneficiary of Professor Jennings' genius. The first NoMan story was drawn by Reed Crandall, and it was a beauty. The strip featured heavy shading, possibly aided and abetted by some superb Wally inking. The darker colors and NoMan's expressionless face throughout the story emphasized the mysterious android side of his nature. Invisibility was never drawn better in a comic book. It was an art job that may have been equaled but never surpassed in the NoMan stories to come. Excerpt from DC Comics, Thunder Agent's Archives. Copyright 2002. Biographies. Reed Crandall. Born in Winslow, Indiana in 1917, Reed Crandall displayed a natural flair for drawing from his earliest years, a talent that grew as he did, eventually winning him a scholarship to the Cleveland School of Art in Ohio, and then an invitation to illustrate children's books in New York. Once there, Crandall quickly moved from books to editorial cartooning work for the NEA Syndicate, and then to a staff job as an artist for Will Eisner and Jerry Iger's legendary comic production house. Soon afterwards, Crandall was hired by Everett M. Busy Arnold, who worked exclusively for his Quality Comics line, where he quickly made the Black Hawk feature and military comics one of the era's best war comics. Crandall worked for Quality until the early 1950s, when he moved to the up-and-coming EC Publications. Together with his legendary artistic cohorts on EC's new trend titles, Crandall's work there set a standard for comic craftsmanship that many say has never been equaled. Crandall continued to work for various publishers throughout the 1950s and 1960s, perhaps peaking with a resurrection of his classic EC style in Warren's Creepy, Eerie, Blazing Combat, and Vampirella titles. His final story was published in 1973, just 2 years before he suffered a debilitating stroke. He died on September 13th, 1982. Immediately after the first NoMan comic book story was a 2-page text story called Face to Face. For many months, Thunder headquarters had been converting information onto special code cards used by the giant electronic computers which lined the walls of the headquarters. The information concerned the Warlord, every scrap of information that had ever been known concerning his past activities. From this, it would be hoped that the complex computers would be able to furnish some clue as to where the Warlord had come from and who he was. Upon ordinary examination, it seemed little had been learned. The Warlord was the unseen head of a large organization whose goal was to gain scientific supremacy over the largest nations of the world. But to the officials at Thunder headquarters, the threat of the Warlord was a very serious matter. They alone knew that the Warlord possessed many incredible scientific discoveries that would be a definite threat to any nation on Earth. From information which seemed simple enough on the surface, the computers found several definite patterns which had gone unnoticed by the human observers, and had analyzed the types of weapons used by Warlord agents across the nation, and reconstructed supply routes. They had analyzed the types of vehicles used, and reconstructed the paths they would have to take prior to their first sighting. They analyzed the dates of each attack, the number of men taking part in each. The end result was a series of graphs, which all pointed to one spot on the map. According to the computers, it was more than probable that all of the Warlord's operations had started at one certain spot, exactly 3 months before the first evidence of their plot became known. Thunder decided to use NoMan to scout the location indicated on the map and see if any clues to the Warlord still existed at that point. Hiding in the sleek, streamlined vehicle which had been furnished him by Thunder, NoMan had carefully surveyed the wooded area located at the point on the map indicated by the computer. In a clearing was located a large structure of white concrete. Running swiftly around the side of the building, NoMan found that there was no obvious entranceway into the structure. Suddenly, however, a steel ladder began to project from the top of the first level and then lower itself to the ground. Two men dressed in black uniforms descended armed with small ray guns. As soon as they reached the ground and started slowly in the direction of the woods, the invisible NoMan hopped onto the ladder and climbed to the top. Here he found a small open doorway and darted inside. A runway led to a lower level. He followed this until he came to a large room filled with various types of control instruments. Set in one wall was a gigantic television receiver. Suddenly a door at the other end of the room opened, and 24 men dressed in white filed inside. Almost simultaneously, the large television receiver began to flicker into life, but the image that appeared on it was in shadow. All that could be seen of the face were two glowing eyes, shining intensely from beneath the cowl, which covered the top part of the head. NoMan needed no one to tell him that he was getting his first glimpse of the Warlord.
You have been careless,
Came the Warlord's voice from all corners of the room. The distortion made it impossible to identify in any way.
Someone has gotten within range of the #1 base. It is fortunate that it has only one more major function to serve before it is abandoned. But that function is of utmost importance, so nothing must be allowed to threaten it at this time. Do not waste time searching for the intruder in the woods. Lock all entrances immediately, including the underground garage entrances, so that no one can enter for at least an hour. That will be sufficient time for the electronic brains to finish their final problem. Since they were too complicated and large to transport to my newest base, I have been entrusting you to see that they finish their final function where they are. Within 1 hour, their months of calculation should be at an end, and I will at last have the long-awaited blueprint for undermining every government of the world. I am counting on you to see that the machines continue to function smoothly. As soon as they are finished, you can proceed with the evacuation. At my signal, you will activate the timing device on the bomb that will completely destroy the #1 base, and then you will leave immediately. Since none of you know how to make further contact with me, you will receive your payment through the mail. Each of you will receive the $2.5 million promised within the week at your own homes, and you will never speak to anyone of your work for the Warlord.
As the Warlord spoke, the invisible T.H.U.N.D.E.R agent quickly scanned the scientific devices on the wall. Even his own vast knowledge of electronics left him unable to understand many of them. Then his eyes fell upon the intricate mechanism labeled Destruct Switch. On the front of it was a large dial which appeared to be a timing device. But the brilliant mind of NoMan was quickly able to penetrate the confusion of attachments to realize the truth. No matter what time the dial was set upon, as soon as the starting switch was pulled, the electronic impulse would be sent to the explosives immediately. The Warlord had no intention of keeping his word to pay his scientists the millions he had promised. He did not trust them, and planned that none should live for more than another hour. And so the Warlord proved true to the breed from which all tyrants throughout history had sprung. NoMan waited no longer. From his belt, he removed a small cylinder of powerful tear gas. Quickly, he released the gas, and the cinnamon-like odor soon permeated the entire room. The powerful fumes stabbed quickly at the eyes and lungs of the inhabitants, and sent them stumbling swiftly for fresh air. Impervious to such gases, the android body of NoMan remained alert and acted with methodical precision. Quickly, he rearranged the wiring upon the timing device so that it actually would function as the scientists had believed. Then he set it to charge the explosives within 10 minutes. He pushed the alarm bell next to the switch to alert everyone else that might still be within the structure that the installation was primed for destruction, as they had undoubtedly been pre-warned, and then hastened through the door through which he had first entered. He found all the scientists upon the roof of that level, and quickly shouted a warning to them to head for the woods. He then descended the ladder himself and retraced his steps into the woods. Moments later, there was a blinding flash of light, and the first of the Warlord's bases was gone. NoMan marveled at the incredible luck that had enabled him to reach the base in time to upset the Warlord's activities only 1 hour before it would have been too late. Although he had failed in gaining the much-wanted clue to the Warlord's true identity, his mission had certainly not been a failure. But although he had achieved an accomplishment that would cause a major setback to the Warlord's plans, he was also aware that the Warlord would eventually find the means to overcome this upset and continue on with his campaign to subjugate the world, unless the T.H.U.N.D.E.R agents could track him to his lair and put a final end to his activities. But would they be able to? Only time would tell. Excerpt from the July 2001 cover dated comic book artist number 14, Rise and Fall of Tower Comics. Chris Irving on the history of the short-lived comics publisher. Comic books have survived over 6 decades by being a resilient medium. Despite any downfalls that may plague the industry and often devour whole companies, it seems that more companies sprout up in place once the industry hits another upswing. In the mid-1960s, the Marvel line of comic books made comics a commodity again, as even college students were now enjoying the exploits of superheroes such as Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, and the Mighty Thor. Tower Books, a publishing line most known for their inexpensive paperbacks, decided that the 4-color medium may be worth pursuing. With the efforts of publisher Harry Shorten and editor Sam Schwartz, both formerly of Archie Comics, they started a new line of comics to hopefully cash in on the craze. The Tower paperback line was originally started under the World Publishing Company, a company acknowledged with the first book on Charles Lindbergh's historic flight in 1929. World was also the publishers of Webster's New World Dictionary. According to the World Publishing website, World established Tower Books in 1939, a paperback reprint line that cover priced at 49 cents each. The Tower line continued through the 60s, when World Publishing was sold to Times Mirror in 1963. Although there is little information to be had on Tower Books, it is assumed Tower is part of a package deal with World. Whatever the case, the Tower line joined with Midwood Books, a publisher of men's paperbacks, in 1964. Midwood had published male-oriented books featuring scantily clad women on lurid covers, many of which were beautifully painted by artist Paul Rader. Apparently many of Midwood's early novels featured pseudonymous works by established authors, such as Robert Silverberg, Lawrence Block, and Donald Westlake. It is very possible that, with an expanding base, Tower decided to do comic books or was approached by publisher Harry Shorten. According to longtime Archie comic artist Dan DeCarlo, who worked for Shorten at Tower, the details were never very clear. Harry was very secretive about that, DeCarlo recalled. We thought that it was his company and that he formed it. The Tower Comics offices were located at 185 Madison Avenue, New York City, as part of the Tower Books office. Steve Skates, one of the few remaining people involved with Tower, recalled the offices as a typical New York office. There were 1 or 2 rooms in this wing of a floor where the Tower Belmont books were done, Skates described. Just a couple of rooms devoted to the comic book people. There were only 2 people there, Sam Schwartz, who was the editor of the whole line, and some assistant, a letterer. Russ Jones, an infrequent freelance writer for Tower's war title, Fight the Enemy, remembers, the comics department was at the very end of a long, dark hallway. Sam Schwartz and his assistant Bill Vigoda were the only 2 there all the time. It was not like any other company. Harry's father worked as a janitor. No kidding. This old guy with a broom and a mop and a swab. Shorten began his MLJ Archie career as a writer, churning out hundreds of scripts for such characters as Steel Sterling, The Web, Black Hood, Wizard, and many more. In fact, Shorten co-created the first patriotic hero, The Shield, in Pep Comics number 1, January 1940, with artist Irv Novick. Excerpt from the Comic Reader number 197 article by Lou Mougin. The third member of Thunder's triad debuted in the next story. Menthor appeared in a Jack Kirby pose, legs 4 feet apart and on the verge of throwing a haymaker. Excerpt from the Amazing Heroes number 7 article by David Singer. Interestingly, Menthor's costume is virtually identical to that of DC's Silver Age Atom. The only differences are that unlike the Atom, Menthor does not wear a belt, and the emblem on Menthor's mask is a real circle rather than a nuclear atom, and the blue-red color scheme of his tights and boots is reversed. Mougin. Since Kane was also drawing the Atom at the time, the similarity of their costuming was made even more evident. The Enemy Within introduced John Janus, WizKid applicant who passed Thunder's initiation exams with the highest scores ever. Janus. This is child's play. Other applicant. You have to be a genius to answer these questions. Excerpt from Thunder Agent's archive, foreword by Robert Klein and Michael Uslan. John Janus may have become the Thunder Agent named Menthor, but on the splash page of his first story, it was artist Gil Kane who stole the spotlight. It was a great Kane pose, and it screamed the Atom to us fans. But then came 6 pages that sure seemed like George Tuska, Buck Rogers, before Kane returned for the final 5 pages. And the inker must have been Mike Esposito, since many of the figures looked like characters right out of DC's Wonder Woman book or Metal Men. Even the coloring on this strip looked different from the rest of the issue. It was light and bright. Unlike the Wood and Crandall stories, backgrounds were minimal in the Menthor tale. It looked like a rushed art job. But even a rushed art job by Gil Kane was superior to a painstaking job by other comic book artists. John Janus sailed through all the physical and mental tests Thunder threw at him during his recruitment process, but they had no way to test his loyalty. In actuality, he was working for the Warlord and his strike force, the Cobras, and attempting to infiltrate Thunder as a double agent. David Singer. Following a 2-page text story starring NoMan, Chapter 4 of number 1 was entitled The Enemy Within and was subheaded Menthor. Interestingly, not Thunder Agent Menthor. His real name was John J. Janus. Janus was a Greek god with 2 faces. Thus, naming a double agent Janus was a private joke between the writer and his more knowledgeable readers. Apparently, Tower's staff of writers had a thing for Greek mythology. Janus is a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, 28-year-old Adonis. He is 5 foot 11 inches tall, weighs 165 pounds, and is definitely the best-looking Thunder agent. When Thunder decides to test the cybernetic helmet left by Dr. Jennings, they ask their agents for a volunteer. Janus does so. In his words, to get in good with the brass. In the story, we learn that Menthor has the ability to mentally drain the strength of his opponents and add it to his own. Unbeknownst to everyone, in addition to his abilities discussed above, the helmet makes anyone who has even the slightest bit of good in him totally good when he is wearing it. In this first story, Menthor behaves like a Jekyll and Hyde. Every time he takes off the helmet, he schemes how to destroy Thunder on behalf of the Warlord. Every time he puts the helmet on, he saves Thunder. And when he takes the helmet off again, he cannot remember that it was he who saved the day. Excerpt by Klein and Uslan. When the scientists bestowed the cybernetic helmet on their new employee, it amplified his psionic powers of telekinesis, telepathy, and other potential powers of the human brain. The trademark Tower twist on its characters appeared again with Menthor. When he put on the cybernetic helmet, it seemed to rewire his brain so that he became a good and noble character serving Thunder, his country, and his comrades in arms to the best of his ability. Excerpt by Lou Mougin. His assignment: shut down the defenses in Thunder HQ, preparatory to an invasion. Predictably, after Janus lets the Warlord strike force in, he dons the helmet, does a Jekyll-Hyde split, and beats the enemy squad and a giant monster single-handedly. Menthor uses psycho powers sparingly in the fracas, limiting himself to mind reading and sapping the strength of his fallen opponents. The rest was a typical Kane fist-to-chin punch-out. The Warlord was ignorant of Menthor's direct involvement and still held him as a trusted agent at the end of the story. David Singer. This issue ends with him still technically a double agent and a devoted follower of the Warlord. Between issues 1 and 2, however, Menthor has a change of heart and becomes a loyal Thunder agent. Apparently, the constant use of the helmet has turned him into a good person permanently. Klein and Uslan. Needless to say, these actions didn't sit well with his real boss, the Warlord, and before long, Menthor was in danger from both sides. One problem that reared its head all too often in Tower's comic books was a lack of continuity. Of course, this was in an era where continuity was never considered the greatest of priorities by an industry that truly believed in a complete turnover of its young readership every 5 years. Key events would occur in one issue, and by the next issue, sometime by the next story, they were ignored as if they never happened. The biggest continuity glitch in Thunder Agents number 1 occurred in the Menthor tale. There, the Warlord, whose identity and look were carefully kept secret in the other stories, was casually revealed. In this story, the Warlord wore a green head mask and had a human face. He was portrayed as some standard villainous guy with a goatee. Singer. This story offers our first look at the Warlord. His appearance is peculiar because he is made to look like a Caucasian human being. The mistake was never explained. Probably the concept of the Warlord was changed between issues 1 and 2, and no one ever bothered to write a story explaining this error. We must bear in mind that this occurred during the wonder of 1965 through 66, when no one took comic magazines too seriously. Today, if this occurred, a Roy Thomas or a Steve Englehart would write a story explaining how the mortal disguise used in number 1 was used for the benefit of the Warlord's human agents, or something like that. Klein and Uslan. Chalk it up to the problems associated with having 2 editors, Woody and Sam, operating from different places, dealing with different artists, and not being in the closest of communication under the pressure of ongoing deadlines. Excerpt from the July 2001 cover dated Comic Book Artist number 14, The Secret Origin of Tower Comics, A Short History of Harry Shorten by Michael Feldman. Harry Shorten, the man behind Tower, a brief rundown of his achievements. Born 1912, sports pulp writer, editorial director for Archie MLJ Comics from around 1941 into the 50s, writes a panel newspaper strip called There Ought to Be a Law with art by Al Fagaley, 1945 through 70, ? Shorten appears to be involved with sleazy paperback publishing company called Graphic from 1949 to 57. He starts a new company, more likely just a transformation of the former, into Midwood Books in 1957 to 58. After a brief attempt at respectable beginnings, Midwood publishes exclusively hardcore sex novels, by standards of the day, into the mid-60s. Among the people who pass through the door, names that will make fans' eyes light up are Frank Frazetta, Gardner Fox, Lawrence Block, and on and on. Shorten is simultaneously co-publisher with Louis Silberkite, partner in Archie, the L and MLJ, in Belmont Books. They are a more respectable, only moderately sleazy, paperback publisher in the 1960 through 67 period. One can only speculate how long Silberkite and Shorten were partners, though probably longer than is generally acknowledged. Silberkite makes a renewed effort in paperbacks when his pulp-turned-magazine line, Columbia Publications, is killed in February 60 by his distributor. Starting in the mid-60s is a new publishing imprint called Midwood Tower, published by Tower Publications. It veers more towards respectability. Lacking time to elaborate here, readers will have to use their interpolation skills. It is the confident opinion of this author that the Tower Comics line was a brief and essentially last-gasp effort on the part of the two publishers Shorten and his silent partner Silberkite when they found their paperback lines were going down the tubes. With the censorship laws in the US becoming liberalized in the mid-60s, they could see the writing on the wall. Everybody, from legitimate publishers to Johnny-come-lately new entrants, started porn, now called erotica, lines, and Midwood Books lost their dominant share of the marketplace. Belmont was just sleazy, cheap, and lousy, dying of natural causes. Shorten and Silberkite, perhaps hiding in the background to protect his Archie image, was just one of many quick buck artists who got back into superhero comics publishing around 1965, spurred by a renewed interest in nostalgia and pop culture. This was further escalated by the Jules Feiffer article in Playboy that became the book The Great Comic Book Heroes. Hugh Hefner started showing old Batman serials at his famous quasi-orgy parties at the Playboy Mansion. The publicity led ultimately to a successful matinee theatrical release of them in 1964 through 65. This led to the TV show, and the rest is history. Excerpt by Lou Mougin. At the other end of the spectrum, Thunder Agents #1 introduced the fourth and final feature that was anything but spectacular. It was derivative, dull, and poorly done. Tower must have gotten the message quickly because it only ran 4 issues. Of course, the feature was Thunder Squad, the weak sister of an otherwise excellent group of strips. The squad was drawn in all 4 issues by Mike Sekowsky. Excerpt by Klein and Uslan. Thunder Squad was a comparatively humdrum feature compared to the glitz, action, humor, and character twists found in the other superhero strips. The squad was a super commando emergency strike force akin to DC's Blackhawks or the Challengers of the Unknown. 5 non-super specialists who cooled off hot spots around the globe. Each one was pretty stereotyped. The pencils were by Mike Sekowsky, best remembered for his 8-year stint on DC's Justice League of America. Excerpt by David Singer. The 5th chapter starred the Thunder Squad. This group of 4 men and 1 woman is a task force composed of Thunder's best non-super agents. Guy Gilbert is the leader of the squad. A former U.S. Major and Medal of Honor recipient, Guy is a specialist in military tactics and strategy. Yale grad, All-American group leader. Guy Gilbert was the squad leader and matinee idol. John Adkins, referred to as Dynamite, is a former officer of an underwater demolition squad. Dynamite, in addition to being the demolitions expert of the team, is also the group's muscle man. In Thunder Agents #11, he will be groomed as Dynamo's understudy. Dynamite's main problem is that his intelligence is a bit on the low side. Group muscle man who, in later issues, is renamed Dan Adkins, joining Lynn Brown as a creator whose name becomes permanently intertwined in the comic book. Catherine Kane, referred to as Kitten, a girl, was a token sex bot and software expert. A former MIT science professor, as well as a scientist and inventor, is a technical expert that specializes in communications. But as are all the Thunder Agents, she's also expert in karate and firearms. Kitten Kane. Gil gets a character named for him in the shapely form of the group's tech expert and resident martial artist. In the later issues, she would compete with Alice for the affections of Dynamo, but even further down the road, became romantically connected with Guy Gilbert. William Wily, referred to as Weed, is the team's resident lockpick and escape artist. The most engaging of the bunch was a weasel-like, chain-smoking, shifty-eyed safecracker short on intellect but long on cunning. He dreams of being a James Bond-style character. Weed was introduced in this manner, quote, after a somewhat shady past, was reformed by chance to do useful work as a member of the Thunder team. This was never elaborated upon nor explained. Chain-smoking, reformed burglar reminiscent of both Wally Wood and one of his assistants. Egghead, true name never divulged, is a genius who formulates strategy and acts as a fount of knowledge. Egghead, well, his name says it all. He ended up being snuffed unceremoniously in the 2nd issue. Nobody in the story seemed to notice. On their own, the group was about as exciting as white bread. They were soon phased out and became fairly interesting supporting characters in other strips. In this first story, the Warlord's zombie soldiers attack U.S. armed forces in order to capture a new laser weapon. The Thunder Squad and the U.S. forces are taken over by the Warlord's mind control powers, but Egghead's superior brain proves to be too much for the Warlord to handle. The laser is recaptured and the Warlord fails. Where Dynamo had the Thunder plane and NoMan had the Thunder car, the squad got the huge helijet and used it well to crush the Warlord's zombie men army. They were successful, but the Warlord boasted of his capture of Dynamo to them, allowing a tie-in with his earlier story. As fans, we couldn't help but wish that those 10 squad pages had been devoted to yet another new dazzling Wally Wood Thunder Agent superhero. Before too long, Tower would get the message and make some big changes. Excerpt by Lou Mougin. Finally, in Dynamo's second outing in the book, he was to have 2 stories per issue until number 5. The entire cast and crew assembled in Justice Society fashion to reunite Dynamo with his belt and drive the Iron Maiden from her island base. Excerpt by Klein and Uslan. A virtual pinup page of the Iron Maiden comprised a splash page to the final chapter of issue number 1, with Dynamo bound amid gobs of Wally Wood machinery in the presence of his archenemy. In this story, we learned that the Thunderbelt sent out a tracer radio signal when used in an unauthorized manner. The 3 most memorable aspects of this concluding story was the reappearance of the Iron Maiden, the gorgeous art of Wally Wood and Dan Adkins, and the emotional impact of a sequence in which NoMan risked death as his android body was torn to shreds by what seemed like 100 bullets during his superhuman attempt to get the Thunderbelt to Dynamo and turn it on before it was too late. Memorably, the unseen agent had to crawl the last few yards in order to succeed. Excerpt by David Singer. Also featured in this segment was someone who would be one of the agent's most durable villains, the Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden, or Rusty, could be compared to Poison Ivy or Catwoman in the Batman mythos. While she's one of Dynamo's most persistent enemies, she has the hots for him and is constantly trying to get him to switch alliances. In issue number 1, she is a lieutenant in the employ of the Warlord and has captured Dynamo by the end of the chapter. The story is continued in chapter 6, the team-up story, when Menthor, NoMan, and the Thunder Squad rush to his rescue. Need I bother to say who wins? Of course, as with most of the agent's other foes, Iron Maiden escapes to return later. These were the very orderly components of Thunder Agents number 1, an intro, 4 origin solo adventures, and then a team-up story involving the 4 solo stars. The writers of the issue were Larry Ivy, Lynn Brown, and Wally Wood. Excerpt by Lou Mougin. The last caption of the book promised, "See the criminals brought to justice in the next issue of Thunder Agents." All in all, it was one of the best illustrated first issues of the mid-60s. And even if the dialogue was wooden, the art was wood. It was to set the format for the next 18 issues of the book. Excerpt by Klein and Uslan. The fantastic first issue was over. Clearly, the Thunder Agents were different from the JLA or Avengers. They were conceived as a team from the very beginning, not as a super army formed by characters who were already successful. These new characters were human, employees doing a job. If they messed up, they could be fired, and the next guy in the line would get the superhero job opportunity. At night, they took off their costumes, packed up their lunch pails, and headed home on the subway. The action played out on a human scale, with humor and unexpected character developments galore. For all his heroics, Lynn Brown still had trouble getting a date with Alice, the chief secretary. For all his courage, he was still played for a sucker by the Iron Maiden. Wood's storytelling style used the minimum of words, relying heavily on the art to carry the mood and meaning of the story. This was in distinct contrast to Marvel's wordier comics. With the freedom he was granted by Tower, he was able to control the stories and carry out this philosophy. Not satisfied with the art and dialogue, Wood also developed plots and springboards for the other writers. His passion for Thunder Agents came through issue after issue. It was truly a labor of love for him. His distinctive style dominated the look of each book because his inks, or the inks of Dan Adkins and the key assistants who echoed his style, helped unify the look of what would become a growing superhero line of comics. Excerpt from Don Markstein's Toonopedia, Undersea Agent. Creators Sam Schwartz, editor, and Ray Bailey, artist. In the mid-to-late 1960s, spy agencies with acronyms for names were all the rage. The 2 most prominent examples in comic books were Marvel's Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Tower Comics' Thunder Agents, both of which melded the genre with the one most prominent in comics, superheroes. Tower did so well, at least initially, with Thunder. The following year it launched another. Since the one already extant was pretty all-pervasive on and above our planet's surface, and also covered caverns underneath, the new one didn't have much choice in operating areas. But underwater adventuring wasn't entirely unprecedented in contemporary comics. DC Sea Devils was still a going concern, and that's where they placed it. The hero was a US Navy lieutenant, appropriately, if implausibly, named Davy Jones. In a story scripted by an unknown writer, possibly Sam Schwartz, best known for his work at Archie Comics, he edited the title. In the second issue, Davy acquired minor superpowers, which helped him fit in with the rest of the comic book heroes of the day. But he must not have fit in all that closely, because his comic was gone after a mere 6 issues. The last dated March 1967. Other than a guest appearance in Thunder Agents number 13, June 1967, that's all there ever was of Undersea Agent Davy Jones. Excerpt from the December 1981 cover dated Amazing Heroes number 7, Meanwhile, Under the Sea, by David Singer. 2 new Tower titles, both cover dated January 1966, were published at the same time as Thunder Agents number 2, Undersea Agent number 1, and T.H.U.N.D.E.R number 1. While T.H.U.N.D.E.R was a binky, Archie-type comedy romance magazine, and does not merit discussion in a magazine called Amazing Heroes, Undersea Agent involved a different UN Special Security Force, the United Nations Department of Experiment and Research Systems established at Atlantis. In the first quarterly issue, Lieutenant Davy Jones of the U.S. Navy is recruited to join Undersea, whose base of operations is an underwater complex built upon the ruins of ancient Atlantis. The secret organization is run by Professor Weston. Scooby Doolittle, who was rescued from a sinking fishing boat, provides comic relief a la Doiby Dickles and Etta Candy, and serves as Lieutenant Jones's sidekick. Jones meets Renata Del Mar, a beautiful seafaring adventuress, and her male assistant, Court. They both join in his adventures against Dr. Fang, an agent of the Red Chinese who discovered ancient Lemuria and took control over its water-breathing humanoid populace. His goal is to take over the world. With this cast of characters, the magazine featured an endless stream of James Bond-type underwater adventures. Excerpt from the website, Spy Guys and Gals. 1964 saw the arrival on television of The Man from U.N.C.L.E. And in the world of entertainment where James Bond was a huge hit, Napoleon Solo and Ilya Kuryakin were wildly welcomed. At the same time, Marvel Comics has reinvigorated the superhero genre a couple of years before with the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, and many others. That made the rest of the publishing world take notice. The next year, 1965, a small but ambitious Tower Comics, a subsidiary of paperback publisher Tower Publications, released its premium title. Thunder Agents gave the comic book readers a combination of both spy and supers, with a small team of superpowered individuals. Dynamo, NoMan, and Menthor were the initial agents. It was successful enough in the first year that the powers that be, namely Wally Wood, decided to add another title to the mix. Since Thunder Agents kind of had the surface world covered, it was decided to go underwater, and thus Undersea Agent was born. That title would only last 6 issues, each one containing several adventures. An apparent leftover story was used as a filler in a Thunder Agents issue afterwards. That mouthful of an acronym stands for United Nations Department of Experiment and Research Systems established at Atlantis, and is an international peacekeeping and exploratory department tasked with all things happening under the ocean's surface. It is the brainchild of its founder and director, Professor Weston. While it is obviously a highly secret organization, since an experienced officer like Jones had never heard of it before, it is extremely well funded as shown by the immense facility it uses at the sea's floor and the tremendous amount of cool toys its people get to play with. Weston is a hoot, being a constant pipe-smoking old scientist with a bald head except for wild wing-like tufts on the sides, heavy bushy white eyebrows, and a beard and mustache to rival St. Nick. He is an undeniable genius and constantly at work with new inventions that seem to be just finished the moment they are needed. The Atlantis part of the long name of the organization comes from the fact that the base which Weston creates lies quite near the underwater excavation site of the original sunken island of that name. Jones is a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy. He is a highly skilled fighter pilot, which will come in quite handy with all the vehicles he is asked to man or pilot, or drive or steer. He is also a trained scuba diver. When shown in a skin-tight wetsuit or when topless, it is obvious that the man is in the peak of condition, and he becomes even more determined to stay there as the series progresses. Jones is a rather tall individual, likely 6'2" or thereabouts. He has a full head of wavy black hair with tufts always falling across his brow. And that is about all that can be said of Jones, because there is so very little told of his life before or outside of his becoming an agent. Working with him from the first day he arrives at Atlantis is a young man named Scooby Doolittle. He is an orphan found by Weston and given a position doing odd jobs on the base. He latches on to Jones and the two become good friends, with Jones taking on the big brother role like he owned it. Scooby provides the requisite actions of a sidekick, including making mistakes but showing a good heart. He also saves the day a time or two. There's also the beautiful Renata Del Mar, daughter of another maritime scientist and a recruit as an agent in the first recorded adventure. She's there for a short while but then disappears, sadly. From the adventures that Jones has, it is obvious the ocean has spawned a lot of mad scientists, several of whom are from the Far East, and all of them wanted to rule the world. They don't make it. Excerpt from the website mycomicshop.com, Undersea Agent number 1. Cover by Ray Bailey. Stories and art by DJ Arneson and Ray Bailey. A spin-off of Tower's Thunder Agents book, as Lieutenant Davy Jones and his hero team Undersea defend the Earth's oceans from supervillainy. When Davy is assigned to destroy an American aircraft carrier, he learns about the sinister forces opposing humanity and Undersea, the secret United Nations underwater squadron. While pursuing the sinister Dr. Fang, Davy meets the beautiful Renata Del Mar. Davy's teen sidekick Scooby stumbles on an adventure of his own while visiting an undersea radar dome. Plus fun facts about undersea exploration, 1960s diver tech, and nitrogen narcosis, aka the bends. Stories include Sink the Carrier Gettysburg, Undersea Agent meets Dr. Fang, The Escape from Lemuria, Food, The Cycle of the Sea, Underwater Exploration, Rapture of the Depths, The Adventures of Scooby Doolittle, 64 pages, full color, cover price 25 cents. While not providing any reference, Mike's Amazing World of Comics asserts that Tower Comics produced no comic books in October 1965, but that November released T.H.U.N.D.E.R number 2 and Undersea Agent number 1. T.H.U.N.D.E.R will go on to become Tower's most successful comic book, running for 26 issues into November 1969. So it's at worst tied for first place with Thunder Agents, and that means Undersea Agent is only the third title from Tower, predating the second issue of Thunder Agents and all of the Thunder Age spin-off titles. Undersea Agent was not directly tied to Thunder Agents. It's a different UN organization. The book is itself not tied to the success of Thunder Agents. It's a 64-page comic that came out 2 months after Thunder Agents number 1 in newsstand distribution. It took 6 months to get sales numbers. So this was clearly in the pipeline, especially when you factor in that it's the same creative team for the majority of the issue. Despite assertions that there were multiple stories in this comic, yes, there are, but the majority of the comic is one continuous serial. Cover copy reads, another Tower Comics super action thriller. Follow the daring exploits of Lieutenant Davy Jones as he joins forces with Undersea in the fight against the forces of Dr. Fang for control of the world beneath the sea. And on the cover, there's a little circle with Dr. Fang in it, who is very much a Yellow Peril character. Yes, it's the 1960s. Yes, this Asian fellow has yellow skin, deep Orientalism, along with this walrus mustache thing, and a widow's peak. And he says, those fools, who do they think they are to try to overcome the invincible Dr. Fang? So the story starts with Davy Jones as a jet pilot being ordered to sink the USS Gettysburg. This is because the entire crew's been killed by gas released by Dr. Fang, and the military doesn't want the vessel to be taken over. So they've already lost the crew. They don't want to make sure they don't lose the ship as well. I think it's alternately 12 or 13 different vessels around the world that have been taken in this way. So that's part of why the government knew what was going on. Dr. Fang is essentially putting together a armada of sea vessels. This is a seeming aircraft carrier. I think he's supposed to have submarines and such as well. So after performing well, blowing up an aircraft carrier that was unmanned, so I don't know how hard that would have been necessarily, Davy Jones is ordered to go under the water, and he goes to the base that's known to become Atlantis, and we're seeing all the highfalutin special effects stuff. He meets all the guys we've talked about before. We talked about how Dr. Fang basically went down to Lemuria, managed to enslave its population, and then turn them into an army against the rest of the world. We're introduced to Scooby, who's a klutz, and they give you this very involved pseudoscientific explanation for the suit that they're going to give Lieutenant Davy Jones so that he can be the Undersea Agent. And even though it has all kinds of cool stuff in it, we really don't get to see him do very much stuff with it. He even doesn't wear the suit all that much in the issue. The first story segment ends with a full-page splash of Undersea Agent in full garb, and then the first instance of several where they undermine their own premise, the very next page shows that they've given this guy a sea saucer, which is his own special vessel. It's blown up before the end of the first page of the next segment. Both Scooby and Davy Jones have to be saved by the beautiful Renaka Del Mar. Her father was Professor Del Mar, who had his own base, was working against Dr. Fang, worked closely with Professor Weston. Fang murdered her father. Later in the issue, he's going to burn down their island base. Renaka is assisted by a eye patch wearing one-eyed dude chain smoker named Court. He's the one piloting the boat that they used to rescue the two guys from undersea. Make a mental note of that because I didn't and I got confused later on in the story. They take the boat back to Villa Del Mar. They run across a bunch of Lemurians there as they're burning stuff down. The Lemurians are alternately represented as sort of dark-skinned, gray-skinned Morlocks like the ones from the Time Machine. So they got long white hair and jacked up teeth, and they are somewhat primitive looking, referred to as savages. Other times they appear to be Native Americans, but those guys tend to have the skin diver suits, so it seems like maybe those are surface dwellers who are working with Dr. Fang. Racial politics are squicky, but we're starting off from the premise that the main bad guy is a yellow-skinned Oriental. There's no way this thing was going to come out looking good. And that probably helps explain why these stories have never been reprinted in the United States and have not been reprinted in 50, 60 years. So the quartet decides they're going to take one of the Lemurian ships and run it back to Dr. Fang to confront him. They think they're going to catch him by surprise, but he's immediately onto them, and so he traps them in Lemuria. Dr. Fang does the full Dr. Evil, I'm going to tell you my master plan and torment you before you die. In the comics, she's alternately Renaka or Renata, or maybe it's just a lettering issue. She pretends to faint and then whispers to Davy Jones that Dr. Fang is a sensitivity to light. Given how his eyes are depicted in this comic book, I guess that shouldn't be a surprise. surprise. Our heroes briefly turn the tables on the bad guys and they manage to sneak away, but then they're trapped in a flooding room. It's weird because so much of the issue is spent with Davy Jones not having his helmet on, so he has to keep holding his breath and is constantly threatened with drowning. It's like, dude, your name is Undersea Agent. You should have probably had the balloon on your head this whole time. What are you doing? So at some point, the one-eyed dude, Court, is sent away to get a sea saucer, which doesn't entirely make sense because we saw the sea saucer get blown up early on in the issue. Also, Court is apparently mute or just really, really quiet. So he barely appears in the story. I keep forgetting that he's there. And after various misadventures where Dr. Fang keeps anticipating what the heroes are going to do and countering very well and almost getting them killed, Court turns up again with the sea saucer and they're very congratulatory of him. He seems to be the hero of the day. And I remember getting to that page and being like, wait, who's Court? The guy had made so little impression and shown up so little, I didn't remember the guy even being in the story. So, writing issue. One thing that's kind of neat with these books, I like that Tower has a cinematic quality to it. Their stuff reads a lot like dialogue. There's not a bunch of big captions. There's not a lot of dialogue in each individual panel. So the stories, even though they're very long, they're very brisk. And so you get through them fairly quickly, although there is some weird stuff that doesn't really translate very well to comics. Like there's one panel where the professor guy's giving you backstory on Dr. Fang and he ends the sentence with the exclamation, Dr. Fang. And the next panel, the last panel on the page, it's just Davy Jones saying, Dr. Fang. And then the professor saying again, Dr. Fang.
Janet!
Dr. Scott!
Janet!
Dad!
Rook!
There's a lot of pages in this comic book, and even though some of this material would have really benefited from a little bit more exposition and maybe a little bit more thought of where each action beat was going, they have plenty of pages. They have the room to put a random, unnecessary, redundant panel in there. I just kind of wish they'd use that space to get a little bit deeper into the story. But again, I'm really thankful that this is not a DC comic. You really blow through it. It's a fairly amusing read, even though it's somewhat frustrating as well. And it's just a lot of incidents. Plot complication, plot complication, plot complication. But it's very Tango and Cash. It's very just go with it, have fun with it, don't give it a moment's thought. It doesn't really make a lot of sense if you think about it. Like for instance, they get away with this sea shuttle and there's a bomb on it. And Dr. Fang's like, great, I'm going to give him an hour to get closer to the Straits of Magellan because he knows that if he blows up the ship and they somehow survive, that the Straits are going to kill him anyway. But Scooby goes looking for some blankets and pillows to help him in the rougher waters. And he just happens to find a bomb just sitting there. And so they flush it down the toilet essentially and it blows up. And Dr. Fang thinks that they've been blown up, but instead they make it back to Atlantis okay. It's the one time in the story where Fang really comes across as a boob, where most of the time he was just way out in front of the other agents and made them look bad in the first issue of the comic book where they really kind of need to look good. So anyway, there's a one-page comic book story about the cycle of life of fish, mostly how they feed on plankton, they die, and then they feed the plankton, and then the fishes eat plankton, blah, blah, blah. Then there's a 2-page article on different diving techniques and how they used to use diving bells and such. And then there's a 1.5-page all text piece about Rapture of the Depths, which mostly involves nitrogen narcosis, aka Serenity of the Deep, where you get too much nitrogen in your blood, you get disoriented, you don't know up from down, and you have a tendency to drown. And then finally, there's the backup story, The Adventures of Scooby Doolittle. The guy has been a dummy for a lot of the time, but he was somewhat useful in terms of at least fisticuffs in the last story. And then here, he wants to become an agent. Nobody has any real regard for the guy, though. He goes off schedule. He's not really training. He's not really doing anything. So goes out scuba diving. He happens upon a sabotage at an outpost near Atlantis. He has to make sure that the Lemurians don't find Atlantis and report that back to Dr. Fang. He helps make sure that doesn't happen. And because even though he was somewhat insubordinate, although I don't know how he's a military guy because he was an orphan found, he runs around in the uniforms, but I'm not sure that he's actually in any sort of military organization. But Dr. Weston agrees that after the work that he did in this story, they're going to go ahead and put him up as a agent trainee, and he's very happy about that. So that's a 9-page story at the back end. So it's the only additional proper story after the serialization of the origin story, essentially. There were no creator credits in these comics, but the popular consensus seems to be that this series was written by D.J. Arneson. Born in 1935, he's believed to have begun writing for Dell Comics in 1962. He worked on the Beverly Hillbillies and co-created the first African-American lead in a mainstream comic, the Western hero Lobo. While still at Dell, he moonlighted on Charlton's Go-Go and Tower's Undersea Agent. At the same time, he worked on Dell's superheroic takes on Frankenstein and Dracula, as well as the single issue of the robotic Neutro. He also did Dell's undersea spy book Werewolf, which must have been confusing on multiple levels, not the least of which how much he looked like the G.I. Joe Snake Eyes, including a wolf companion. Yes, a scuba diver naturally hung out with a wolf. Later in the 60s, Arneson moved into sci-fi and horror, on titles like The Outer Limits, Dark Shadows, and Ghostly Tales, though he still made time for Gentle Ben, Abbott and Costello, and The Monkees. With his comics cohort Tony Tallarico, Arneson moved into juvenile prose fiction in the 1970s, publishing dozens of short stories into the 1980s. Don John Arneson passed away in 2018. According to Lambiek, artist Ray Bailey was born in 1913 to a New York newspaper reporter. He went on to work at the Fleischer Studios on Betty Boop and Popeye cartoons. Late in the 1930s, he assisted on a number of newspaper comic strips, including those produced by Milton Caniff. In the 40s and 50s, Bailey drew several strips of his own, including Vesta West, the Robert Heinlein adaptation Space Cadet Tom Corbett, and Bruce Gentry, which became a movie serial in 1949. Ray Bailey drew the Dell Comics version of Steve Canyon and was said to have ghosted on the actual Milton Caniff newspaper strip. Also at Dell Comics, Bailey drew Turok, Son of Stone, plus various adaptations for their 4-color anthology, and several Boris Karloff comics for their spin-off company Gold Key. Bailey worked on all 6 issues of Undersea Agent, which may sound slight, but since each issue was about triple the length of a standard comic, that's closer to 18 issues worth of pages across all contributing artists. Ray Bailey passed away in 1975.
We have discovered that there was a comic series from the 1960s called Thunder Agents, and these were superheroes working for the United Nations, and now we have just heard news that there will be produced into a major action movie and then a television series. I mean, part of the fascination with comics is a lot of people, I mean, they basically affiliate and identify with a superhero who fights crime, fights injustice, and tries to create a more safer, healthier world. And that's exactly what the United Nations is doing. The UN fights conflict, fights human rights violations, tries to create better conditions for the future. And therefore, there are no superheroes in real life, but we have a United Nations which is doing the work of superheroes.
Coda excerpted from the Comic Reader number 197 by Lou Mougin. Where do they stand in retrospect? Actually, more favorably than most. In Thunder, Wally Wood unleashed his best post-EC Comics work. His run on Daredevil is hardly comparable. The Wood Dynamo still stands as one of the best drawn superheroes of that period. Thunder Agents also featured equally high-quality work by Crandall, Kane, and Ditko. 2. Thunder Agents was the first regularly published giant-sized comic featuring original material to survive for an extensive run. Tower was the exception at the time when the 32-pager was king. In the increasingly complex world of superhero scripts and soap opera characterization, Tower proved that solid plots, self-contained stories, and 10-pagers could be effective. And of course, they gave us Dynamo, NoMan, and Menthor, whom most 60s fans remember as fondly as most of the Marvel and DC horde of that time. Moreover, Tower had proven that a third force comics company could compete with the 2 established superhero publishers, and win. Most of the miners were willing to pick up the crumbs from the DC Marvel table. Tower Comics stood beside the 2 giants in terms of sales and quality. Of the second string publishers, Tower Comics was the only first-rate group.
In a polarized world, and which is the world we live in, to be able to bond over our pop culture is a truly wonderful thing. One of the magic things about Thunder Agents is they don't come from another planet. Nobody's been bitten by an insect that gave them powers. These are everyday people in all walks of life from many different countries around the world. They are recruited, and then they are given an identity. They are given a technological device from the scientists from different countries in the UN that gives each one a superpower. And with that superpower comes severe moral choices and severe consequences. So there's a human element of it, but it's about everyday people who have an opportunity to become empowered.
Coda from Thunder Agents Archives Volume 1 by Robert Klein and Michael Uslan. The action, the humor, the soap opera, the conflicted characterizations, the superheroics. Thunder Agents blended them all in a way that never got stale. Not bland, not melodramatic and angst-ridden like the competition could be. These heroes were humans filled with faults and shortcomings they would continually strive to overcome, with varying degrees of success. Funny without being slapstick, full of action without being mindless. It all came together in a way that was rarely topped in the Silver Age. The villains had us coming back for more each issue, with the Iron Maiden being perhaps the best femme fatale ever in comic books. This was quintessential Silver Age superheroics, and it didn't get any better than Thunder Agents.
Amazing.
Diablo Frank here. For most of this episode, I've been reading other people's words, so I want to get in a few of my own here at the end. I will concur with the consensus that Dynamo was the best strip overall, but NoMan is my favorite agent. I want to push back against all the criticism of the Thunder Squad. Not to be mean, but that all sounds like sour grapes from intolerant superhero nerds. I wouldn't put the Thunder Squad up against the best of the Blackhawk Squadron like they seem to want to, but I would argue that it was a lot better than the Blackhawk material getting put out in the same time period. Mike Sekowsky was never the apple of fanboys' eyes, but I firmly embrace his work from this period on books like Showcase and Diana Prince as the New Wonder Woman. Particularly galling was comparing Thunder Squad faintly against Menthor, which was in fact easily the worst strip in the book. I frankly don't think I've ever seen such poor amateurish work from Gil Kane, a career low, and he didn't even do the whole thing. The George Tuska pages are better, but this frankly isn't Tuska's best work either. The premise was novel, but the execution of it left a lot to be desired. Meanwhile, the Thunder Squad looked so snazzy in their little outfits with the matching red boots and jackets, collars popped. Wally is maybe the best character in the whole franchise, and Kid and Kane is stunning in these strips. Kim Novak meets Honor Blackman. Menthor will have its moments, but don't sleep on the squad. Thunder Agent celebrates its Diamond Jubilee in 2025, and it sure doesn't feel like a decade since IDW published their 50th anniversary special. Batman film producer Michael Uslan had set up a movie deal in 2015, got the actual United Nations to help promote it, and that was when the last of the characters' new comics were coming out. A lot of the visibility for the T-Agents in the 21st century was predicated on his getting a movie made, which is why DC had spent so much time involved with the property. I think they'd given up by then, and if Thunder Agents didn't get made during the peak of Infinity Saga, it sure ain't happening post-DCEU, post-Bloodshot, or post-Sony Spider-Verse and Spider-Man. Thanks to Batman 1989, Uslan gets an executive credit on every Dark Knight media project. But today he's 73 and hasn't had a full producer credit since 2008's The Spirit. I'm hoping that by the time I finish covering Thunder Agents in podcast form, that situation will have changed. But we're in one of the property's many fallow periods right now. In more of its 60 years than not, Thunder Agents has been out of print. And I've been a fan of the T-Agents for at least half that long, so I know how it goes. I was first exposed to them via the 1984 Wally Wood's Thunder Agents run, itself nearly a decade gone by then. It was still the roaring 90s though, so there was a Harvey Comics relaunch on the horizon, and boy, there was a story in that. Thunder Agents is one of my favorite comic book subjects, a property of note and long-standing that has never gotten its due. Beloved by few, barely remembered by most, arguably never truly successful. So much effort has been poured into characters who never even rated an action figure, and we haven't even gotten into the legal quagmire of whether there are even rights to be held on these properties. I adore the Thunder Agents, and because of their relative lack of success and output, I've actually had the time and resources to put together a complete set of the Tower comics. I think I got my first back issue for $6 at the 2000 San Diego Comic-Con, and I just last year finished the run with the first issue, although the back cover's long gone and the front is detached. It only cost me $4 a quarter century after starting the attempt, so I'll probably foot the bill for a replacement copy when the opportunity comes up the next time I catch one on sale. To be honest, the Silver Age is the era of comics that I care about the least, and I didn't even keep all of Martian Manhunter's run and House of Mystery as the issues passed through my hands. Quite a few during that same single trip to San Diego, only to be flipped without significant profit at my comic shop once I'd gotten to read the stories inside. But I held on to my Thunder Agents, because they were such a joy to look at, so breezy and fun to read compared to anything Marvel or DC was putting out at the time. Thunder Agents could be very dramatic, deadly serious even, but if there's one thing every revival has blown, it's the sense of wry humor. As great as it was to have a murderer's row of talent on the 1984 series, it came a few years too soon, because I'd say contributor Keith Giffen best exemplified the feel of the book when he joined James DeMatteis and Kevin Maguire to relaunch the Justice League. Thunder Agents was the clearest influence on and antecedent to the JLI. And if the prospect of covering such material doesn't excite you, plan on skipping every other episode of Amazing Heroes podcast this year. If I had room on my plate, I could easily launch a devoted Thundercast. But the comic book bears already tried that before during the IDW days, and stalled out after about 8 issues. The feed is dead, as best I can tell, but they recently put the episodes back up on YouTube. I want to celebrate the Jubilee, but I don't need the pressure of having to support a show on its own, especially with each issue so massive. I do hope to get through several issues per podcast going forward, and my own project seems to be the first time anyone has properly incorporated Undersea Agent into their coverage. As with Dynamo and NoMan series, I have a complete and quite economical set of Undersea Agent, which was only ever partially reprinted by cannibalizing the Gil Kane material. I mean, Wonderland may have done them all, but their publication scheme is even more Byzantine and niche than Thunder Agents'. Point being is that you shouldn't expect more Thunder Agents coverage next month, so I hope you'll savor it as much as I do when I can get around to it. The plan for 2025 is to get out 12 Amazing Heroes podcasts, and therefore 6 Thunder Agents episodes, which won't even get us through the Tower releases. So even if you're not feeling the thunder, at least it'll spur on the production of other indie superhero podcasts that you may like more. And now on to our amazing listeners: Ad Astra, Anime Freaks, Anime Nostalgia, Dr. Ange, Between the Pages, Billet Spy Vinyl, Chris Dunford, Coffee and Comics Podcast and Blog, Dana Rubber NYC, Dave's Comic Heroes Blog, Dr. G Nerdologist, Dirk Ashton, Ed Moore at Teal Productions, Edge Deep, ElfQuest, Fantasy with Teeth, who added of the Origins of Independent Comics by Charles Myerson episode, a nice spotlight on the early days of ElfQuest. Fabio Buelvas El Impresa, Fogweaver, Gregory Litchfield, The Hammer Strikes, Random Geeky Stuff, History of Comics on Film, Hyper Casey, The Irredeemable Shag, Jim Imbruglia, SCTV Forever, Julia Raoul, Justice Trek, Keith G. Baker, King Dinosaur, Kirk Spencer, Lizanne Oswald, Max Apocalypse, Mount Lucha Sacrificio Dark, My Comic Book Collection 70s to 90s, Never Iron Anything, Nick Spence, Richard Field, Rick Slick Rick Shelley, Roger Preeb, Rust Belt Innovators, Speaker Cone, Superbound, Talk Dirty to Me, Tutras Torneo, and Tuck.
The preceding podcast is a not-for-profit informational work. Any copyrighted materials contained are believed covered under fair use. No copyright infringement is intended. This has been a Rolled Spine podcast.